Hello guys, welcome to my channel. Today we will be discussing about rise and fall of literary periods. So what leads to the rise of a literary period and what leads to its downfall? We will be discussing that in detail as well as the contrasts between each literary period. So before moving ahead, let's have a brief look into the periods of English literature. The first period we know is Old English period or the Anglo-Saxon. Next is our Middle English period. Then comes Renaissance, under which we have Elizabethan period, Jacobean period, and Commonwealth period. Then comes the Neoclassical period, under which we have Restoration period, Augustan period, and the Age of Sensibility. Next is Romantic period, Victorian period, Modern, and lastly the Postmodern period. The first is Old English period. So before the starting of Old English period, they used to leave the natives of England. Who were the natives of England? The Celts used to be the natives of England. So when the Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded these Celts and started capturing the Celts and ruling England, the period fell into their name as Anglo-Saxon period, or also we called it as Old English period. From then, when the Norman conquest happened in 1066, that is, William, the Duke of Normandy of France, conquered Anglo-Saxon England, the period was called as Middle English period. So what is the cause between the shift of Old English period to Middle English period is this Norman conquest. Let's have a look about the contrast between Old English period and Middle English period. So the first contrast is Old English period used to follow this oral tradition and they used to have this one form of literature, that is poetry. Whereas in the Middle English period, we saw the introduction of plays. What kind of plays? Mystery, morality, and miracle plays. Mystery plays were those plays that were written from Bible. Morality plays were the instructional plays, often fictional or non-fictional, and miracle plays were the lives of saints. So these were the three kinds of plays popular in Middle English period. The next contrast is Old English period had elegiac tone in its literary works. What is an elegy? Deep sense of loss, exile, and nostalgia of glorious past is called as an elegy. So this was a dominant form of writing in Old English period. Whereas in the Middle English period, we see a new figure of speech, that is allegory. What is an allegory? Using events or characters to symbolize abstract ideas. Next is Old English period used alliterative words. What is an alliteration? It's a repetition of initial consonant sounds. So Old English period writers used alliteration often in their poetry. But in the Middle English period, the introduction of rhyming was seen. What is a rhyme? Two words having same or similar ending sounds is called as a rhyme. So the introduction of rhyming was seen in the Middle English period. If we talk about genre, Old English period had only one kind of genre, that is heroic genre. But in the Middle English period, we see the rise of romance. Romance included supernaturalism. It included courtly love. It also included the lives of knights and their adventures. So these all fell under the category of romance, and we used to see this rise of romance first in the Middle English period. So after Middle English period, we see Renaissance coming into the scenario, So the first age under NSI is Elizabethan period. What is the cause between the shift of Middle English period to Elizabethan period is the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottoman kingdom invaded Byzantine kingdom and seized their capital. As a result, Greek scholars of Byzantine Empire fled to Italy with manuscripts. So whatever manuscripts they had, the Greek scholars of Byzantine Empire, when Ottoman kingdom captivated Byzantine kingdom, they fled with those manuscripts to Italy and Europe. That led to the change or revival of literature. So we call it the age of Renaissance in England. Let's see the contrast between Middle English period and Elizabethan period. So first and most important contrast is Middle English period was theocentric and Elizabethan period was anthropocentric. What is the meaning of theocentric? Theocentric is God-centered ideology. So Middle English period's literary works were all God-centered. They used to talk about forgiving, sin, salvation, and Bible. But in the Elizabethan period, in the anthropocentric ideology, we see the man-centered texts. They started writing about life, about society, about beauty, about love. So these were all the major difference between Middle English period and Elizabethan period. The next is in the Middle English period, there were no standardized theatres for the enactment of the plays. There were three kinds of plays, that is mystery, morality and miracle plays, but there were no standardized theatres built for the enactment of those plays. But in the Elizabethan period, we see flourishing of drama. Besides these three kinds of plays, there were more more kinds of plays seen in the Elizabethan period, and professional theatre culture was first built in the Elizabethan period. Coming to poetry, in the Middle English period, we see only religious poetry. There were no other kinds of poetry, but only religious poetry that talked about morality, good versus evil, or Christ, or forgiveness, salvation, etc. But in the Elizabethan period, we see sonnets were introduced. Sonnets is a form of poetry, a 14-lined poem. So this was first introduced in Elizabethan period. It was introduced by Thomas Yuan. Next, talking about language, we see the Chaucerian period had developing English. It was heavily influenced by French and Latin. So English was under development, and as there were the Germanic tribes and there were the French people, Norman people, so the English was not yet fully developed and it was heavily under the influence of the French language and Latin language. But when we come to Elizabethan period, it was still not fully developed, but it was comparatively more refined and expressive than Middle English period. Now, the texts were all in didactic nature. In the Middle English period, it focused on sin and salvation and moral instruction, whereas in the Elizabethan period, texts or literary contexts were all written in about celebration of life, beauty, and ambition. The another important factor here is that Middle English period was ruled by church and feudal system. But in the Elizabethan period, we see the royal patronage, that is, the queen being the ultimate superior power in the. Though the queen used to take advices from the church, or queen used to discuss any important decisions with the church, but Queen had the ultimate power of ruling. Moving ahead, there was a shift in Elizabethan period to Jacobean period, and the cause behind it was death of Queen Elizabeth and accession of James I to the throne. So Queen Elizabeth was unmarried and had no heir to the throne of England. So after the death of Queen Elizabeth, James I, who was Elizabeth's aunt's son, that is her cousin, took over the throne of England. This led to various protests. Some people did not like this decision where Queen Elizabeth was replaced by James I, and some people raised questions about it. Some people support supported the decision. So it all came down to the diversification of the society in England. At the contrast between Elizabethan age and Jacobean age, literature of the Elizabethan age was about entertainment and celebration, but in the Jacobean age it turned darker, cynical, and questioning. In the Elizabethan age, people used to take it in entertainment and celebrated literature. But coming to Jacobean age, the literature turned more darker, more cynical, and questioning. The next contrast is deep interest in human emotions and sense of patriotism was seen in Elizabethan age. People were more loyal to Queen Elizabeth. That sense of patriotism was seen in the literature. Also, the deep interest in human emotions, human life was also seen in the literary works. But in the Jacobean age, writers started exploring satire, corruption, and tragedy. What is a satire? Satire is when someone uses the technique of humor to attack a person or a situation and embarrass them. Talking about tragedy, William Shakespeare wrote his famous four tragedies in Jacobean age. That is, one is Hamlet, next is Othello, next is King Lear, and the last is Macbeth. These four tragedies, important tragedies of William Shakespeare, were all written in the Jacobean age. Now, from Jacobean age to Commonwealth age started because of the English Civil War that led to the execution of King Charles I, the successor of James I. So, English Civil War was also called the Great Rebellion. It was a series of civil wars and political machinations between royalists and parliamentarians in Kingdom of England from 1642 to 1651. So why there was a shift in Jacobean age to Commonwealth age is due to this English Civil War that finally led to the execution of Charles I. Charles I was the successor of James I and he was executed publicly. What was the contrast between these two periods? As we all know, Jacobean period was ruled by King James I, but Commonwealth period was ruled by Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a statesman and he was not a person belonging to royal family. That is the reason it is in itself called as Commonwealth period, because it was led by a common man. The next contrast we see is theatres were highly popularized in Jacobean period. We know that during the Elizabethan period and during the Jacobean period, theatres were highly popularized. But when we come to Commonwealth period, theatres were shut down completely because it was seen as immoral or sinful. So they were shut down completely in the Commonwealth period. The next point is satire and tragedy ruled literature during Jacobean period. Because of the diversification in the society, satire and tragedy ruled in the literature in Jacobean period. But when we come to Commonwealth period, we see the domination of political pamphlets and religious prose. So politics came into literature dominantly in the Commonwealth period. Before Commonwealth period also, they used to write about in societal scenarios, admiring the queen or using the technique of allegory, but not directly. But in the Commonwealth period, we see the domination of political pamphlets directly in the literature. After the Commonwealth period came the Restoration period. What caused the Restoration period? Restoration of monarchy by Charles II. Charles II was the son of Charles I. He came to the throne and he restored the monarchy in England. That led to the rise of a new period, that is Restoration period. Let's have a look on the contrasts between Commonwealth period and Restoration period. The first contrast is Commonwealth period led to the shutdown of the theatres, but with the starting of the Restoration period, we see the reopening of theatres. The second contrast is political pamphlets are widely used in Commonwealth period, but literature in the Restoration period saw the rise of witty, cynical comedy of manners. Now, what is comedy of manners? It is a genre that talks about realistic and satirical comedy, often showing the hypocritical behavior of the elite class or the rich class. That is called as comedy of manners, which was popularized in Restoration period. Moving ahead, after the Restoration period, we have our Augustan period. What led to the rise of Augustan period is the political stability after turmoil. People became tired of wit, immorality, and vulgarity. They wanted refinement, order, and moral restraint. Growing middle class wanted practical wisdom. So, in the Restoration period, they were using comedy of manners, they were using wit, immorality, and vulgarity openly in literature. Now, people became tired of that kind of life. They wanted some order, laws, and refinement in the society. So, that want of stability brought a new period, that is Augustan period. Talking about the contrast between Restoration period and Augustan period, we see that Restoration period had a rise in comedy of manners, which was wit and cynical and also immoral. But in the Augustan period, we only see the peak of satire and not any vulgarity or immorality in the literary texts. In the Restoration period, we see poetry, prose, and drama, all the three forms flourishing in literature. But in the Augustan period, we see a new form of literature, that is novel. First English novel appeared in Augustan period. So that was all about the contrast between Restoration period and Augustan period. After the Augustan period comes the ease of sensibility, which we often call it as transitional phase. Why is it called a transitional phase? Because people were shifting from order, law, and reason to emotion and imagination. They were now tired of this law, this refinement and order, and now they wanted to escape from the reality. So they wanted to talk more about emotions and imagination, escapism. So that is called as transitional phase. If we talk about the contrast between Augustan period and the age of sensibility, in the Augustan period, literature was all about reason. In the age of sensibility, we see a shift of focus on emotion. What I said earlier, Augustan period was all about law, order, and reason and refinement. But in the age of sensibility, there was a slight shift towards emotion and imagination. There was not the complete shift of literature, but there we can see a slight shift in the ideologies of the writers. In the Augustan period, we saw the first English novel appearing. So novel flourished in this age, but in the age of sensibility, we see the dictionary was first published. The English dictionary was first published. So from here we can know that English has finally developed fully in the England. Moving ahead, we have a shift from age of sensibility to romantic period. The cause was the revolutionary age influenced by American and French revolutions. American Revolution happened because Americans wanted freedom from British rule, and French Revolution took place because they wanted to rebel against the monarchy in French. So these two revolutions somewhat affected England and its literature. The contrast between age of sensibility and romantic period can be seen as emphasis on sympathy and emotional responsiveness was seen in the age of sensibility, whereas in romantic period we see an emphasis on imagination and emotion. The next point is age of sensibility focused on social morality, whereas the romantic period focused on individual identity. The age of sensibility emphasized on sympathy, emphasized on social morality, but romantic period was more about individual identity, about imagination, about emotion, about escapism. Age of sensibility wanted to do better for the society, to help others in the society, but romantic period writers expressed it in a way that an individual wants to help himself, not the society. Third point is age of sensibility was sentimental but somewhat controlled. In the romantic period, freedom from rigid rules was seen. So age of sensibility is called the transitional phase. It was not yet fully transitioned, but it was in the process of transition from reason to emotion. That's why, although it was sentimental, but it was somewhat controlled. But in the romantic period, we see the complete transition in the literary work. So there was a complete freedom from the rigid rules, the order, laws, and reason. After romantic period comes the Victorian period. What leads to the rise of Victorian period is the reign of Queen Victoria and the Industrial Revolution. The major transition from agrarian handcrafted economies to machine-driven urbanized manufacturing beginning in England. So Industrial Revolution was about the machinery factories that had started establishing in England. So the shift from handcrafted economy to this industrial economy was a big leap for the society. So that transition led to a various societal issues, societal upheavals that reflected in the literature. Talking about the contrasts between romantic period and Victorian period, romantic period focused on imagination, supernaturalism, But Victorian period focused on realism, contemporary life. Romantic period literary works were often describing about escapism, describing about one's own emotions, imagination, creativity, which was all supernatural and not real. But in the Victorian period, realism was an important factor in literary works. People started discussing about real life issues, contemporary life problems in the society, making it an important contrast. The next point is Romantic period was about individualism, but in the Victorian period, we see conflict between faith and doubt, individual versus society. So, in the Romantic period, people were focusing on individual identity, but in the in the Victorian period, we see a conflict between faith and doubt and individual versus society. That is, we see an internal conflict between people. And the third point, when we come to the form of literature, in the Romantic period, we see the dominant form of literature is poetry. But in the Victorian period, we see the dominant form of literature is novel. Novel had already started flourishing from Augustan age, and now it is in the peak in the Victorian period. After the Victorian period, we have our modern period. Now, what led to the rise of modern period is the disillusionment and trauma due to World War One and World War Two. So both the World War One and World War Two happened during this modern period. And these wars had a greater impact in the society and the consciousness of people that was reflected in the literature. Looking at the contrasts between these two periods, in the Victorian period, novel was a dominant form of literature, but novel was in its plain form. There was no experiments with the novels written during that period. But in the modern period, we see a new kind of novel emerging, that is stream of consciousness novel. Second is Victorian period talked about realism, portraying the world and its social problems without escaping. But in the modern period, we see symbolism as a new technique of writing. Symbolism is something that uses classical or mythic structures to explore modern chaos. The third is Victorian period used naturalism, that is, how human behavior shaped by forces beyond individual control. But in the modern period, we see impressionism, that is subjective reality and mental landscapes. So these were various kinds of contrasts we can see between Victorian period and the modern period. Moving ahead, we have a shift from modern period to postmodern period due to the end of World War II, decolonization, Cold War, and many other factors. So finally the colonized groups were freed from the rules of colonizers, and there was end of World War. Yet there was still presence of Cold War, and that led to various factors and reflections in literature. If we talk about the contrast between modern period and postmodern period, we have various points here. The first is modern period was literature was in search for meaning, order, and truth, whereas the postmodern period rejected the fixed meaning. Hence, it said no single truth exists. As we know, during the modern period, there were two world wars. So people had this trauma of war and disillusionment, and they were in constant search of meaning, in constant search of order and truth. But while they come, or by the time they came to postmodern period, they started rejecting a fixed meaning and they say that no single truth exists. The second contrast is about reality. The perspective of reality changed from modern period to postmodern period. In the modern period, reality was seen as a complex, but it can be understood. But in the postmodern period, reality is seen uncertain, constructed, and unstable. Next is modern period seeks coherence, whereas postmodern period does not need any coherence. Coherence is the quality of being logical and consistent. So, modern period wanted to be logical, but postmodern period did not. In the modern period, there was a respect of high culture, but when we come to postmodern period, there is a mix of high and low culture. There is no separate base of high and low, but we see a equality in both high and low culture. The last point is modern period was serious, pessimistic, concerned with alienation, whereas postmodern literature were playful, ironic, and self-aware. So this shift in characteristics was majorly because of skeptical reaction against the core ideals of modernity. So I hope you understand the video. If you haven't, then please rewind and read the texts, read the points. It will be helpful to you. Thank you so much, and let's meet in another video. Till then, bye bye.